A soldier climbs out of the trench. He knows what's waiting. Machine gun fire, artillery, barbed wire, death. But he climbs anyway. Orders are orders. The officers demand it. He takes 3 steps before a bullet hits him. He falls back into the mud. Hours later, another soldier takes his place. Climbs over the top. Takes 3 steps. Gets hit. Day after day. Week after week. Year after year. The machine guns never stop firing. The artillery never stops exploding. The soldiers never stop dying. For 4 years, this continued. World War I was unlike any war in human history. It was mechanized, industrial, designed to kill humans at scale never before seen. The trenches were the epicenter of this killing machine. Men went into the trenches. Most did not come out. Today, we're going to explore 15 reasons why serving in World War I trenches was essentially a death sentence. If you're interested in the untold stories of World War I, the real experiences of soldiers, and the history that shaped the modern world, subscribe to Surprising. Every week we explore the darkest chapters of history with depth and humanity. Subscribe now so you don't miss our next video, and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. The truth is brutal. The truth is tragic. The truth is necessary to understand. Reason 15. The machine gun. The weapon that changed everything. The machine gun was the defining weapon of World War I. An earlier invention, the machine gun had evolved into a weapon of terrifying efficiency. A single machine gun could fire 400 to 600 rounds per minute. In comparison, a soldier with a rifle could fire maybe 15 rounds per minute. A machine gun, therefore, had the firepower of 30 to 40 riflemen, and that was with one gun. The armies had dozens, hundreds. The British had Vickers guns. The Germans had MG-08s. The French had Hotchkiss guns. All of them could tear through human bodies at distances of 1,000 meters or more. When soldiers went over the top of trenches, they advanced into fields of machine gun fire. The bullets would cut them down like a scythe cutting wheat. Entire regiments would be decimated in minutes. The machine gun made trench warfare a nightmare, made advancing across no man's land suicidal, made the trenches a place where men went to die. Reason 14. Artillery and bombardment. The continuous rain of death. Before soldiers went over the top, the artillery started. Artillery bombardment would last hours, sometimes days. Thousands of shells would rain down on enemy trenches. The explosions were apocalyptic. The ground would shake. Trenches would collapse. Men would be buried alive. A shell could kill everyone in a radius of 50 meters. Some shells were even more powerful. The bombardment was designed to kill as many enemies as possible, to destroy fortifications, to break the enemy's will, but it didn't work as intended. The enemy soldiers would survive, would hide in deep dugouts. Then, when the bombardment ended, the soldiers would climb out, would man the machine guns. The artillery had failed to kill them, but it had announced the coming attack. So when the infantry attacked, the enemy was ready. The machine guns were ready. The artillery, that was supposed to help the infantry, became a setup for the infantry to be slaughtered. Reason 13. Barbed wire entanglements. The razor wire that trapped soldiers. Between the trenches was no man's land, and no man's land was covered in barbed wire. Thousands of meters of barbed wire, strung in patterns designed to slow down advancing soldiers. When soldiers went over the top, they had to navigate through this barbed wire, moving slowly, becoming easy targets for machine guns. The barbed wire would catch on uniforms, would cut skin, would tear into flesh. A soldier trying to escape would become caught, would be unable to move, would be a sitting duck for machine gun fire. Sometimes soldiers would get tangled in barbed wire, would be stuck there for hours, conscious, aware that they were going to die, unable to move, unable to escape. The barbed wire was psychological torture. It was physical torture. It was designed to ensure that soldiers advancing into machine gun fire would be as helpless as possible. Reason 12. Disease and infection. The trenches were worse than the enemy. The trenches were filthy, mud, human waste, decomposing bodies, vermin. Soldiers lived in these conditions constantly. The mud was contaminated with every kind of bacteria imaginable. Feces from men who had dysentery, blood from wounded men, pus from infected wounds. Trench foot was a constant problem. Soldiers' feet would soak in mud and water for days. The skin would rot, the tissue would die, gangrene would set in. Many soldiers would lose their toes. Some would lose entire feet. Trench fever was caused by body lice. The lice would bite soldiers. The bites would cause fever. Dysentery was rampant. Soldiers' digestive systems would fail. They would die from dehydration. Pneumonia, bronchitis, influenza. The diseases killed as many soldiers as the enemy did. A soldier in the trenches was more likely to die from disease than from enemy fire. Reason 11. The constant bombardment, living under constant artillery fire. Even when not under direct attack, soldiers in trenches lived under artillery fire. The enemy artillery would shell the trenches constantly, every day, all day. A shell could come at any moment, while eating, while sleeping, while waiting. The psychological stress of constant bombardment was enormous. Soldiers developed what was called shell shock, or combat neurosis, from the constant fear. But beyond the psychological stress, the physical damage was enormous. Shells would explode in trenches, would kill soldiers instantly, would bury soldiers alive. A direct hit on a trench could kill dozens of men. The constant bombardment meant that soldiers never felt safe, never rested, never recovered. They were in a state of constant terror, constant stress, constant danger. Reason 10. No man's land. The most dangerous place on earth. Between the trenches was no man's land, an area that belonged to neither side. It was often 100 to 300 meters wide, sometimes more. It was a wasteland, cratered with shell holes, covered in barbed wire, littered with corpses. When soldiers were ordered to attack, they had to cross no man's land. They had to advance slowly, had to avoid shell holes, had to navigate through barbed wire, all while being fired upon by machine guns from enemy trenches. There was nowhere to take cover, nowhere to hide. A soldier crossing no man's land was essentially walking to his death. The slaughter was immense. Thousands of soldiers would advance. Hundreds would be killed crossing no man's land. Reason 9. Lack of medical care. Wounded soldiers left to die. When soldiers were wounded, they needed medical care quickly. But in the trenches, medical care was limited. The stretcher bearers had to carry wounded soldiers back to aid stations, but the journey was dangerous. More soldiers could be killed carrying the wounded. Many wounded soldiers died waiting for treatment. The aid stations were often inadequate. Doctors were overwhelmed. An infection that could have been prevented with antibiotics would fester. Modern antibiotics didn't exist. Penicillin wasn't available until near the end of the war. An infected wound meant amputation, or death. Many wounded soldiers chose to remain in the trenches rather than make the dangerous journey to aid stations. Better to die in the trenches than be captured, or die on the way to treatment. Reason 8. Poison gas, the invisible killer. In 1915, the Germans introduced poison gas to the trenches. Chlorine gas, mustard gas, phosgene, other deadly chemicals. A cloud of poison gas would drift into the trenches. Soldiers would try to cover their mouths, but the gas would seep through. Soldiers would choke. Their eyes would burn. Their lungs would fill with fluid. They would die slowly, gasping for breath, burning from inside. Gas masks were developed, but they were uncomfortable. Limited visibility. Some soldiers didn't have them. Exposure to gas, even if not fatal, would cause permanent damage. Blindness, lung damage, scarring of the respiratory system. Poison gas added another dimension of horror to the trenches. Reason 7. The constant noise, the sound that never stops. The trenches were incredibly loud. Artillery exploding, machine guns firing, shells whistling through the air, men screaming. The noise was constant, day and night. Soldiers developed hearing loss, permanent damage to their ears. But beyond the physical damage, the psychological damage was immense. Soldiers couldn't sleep because of the noise, couldn't think because of the noise. The constant noise was like torture. It wore down the mental capacity. Soldiers would develop what was called trench neurosis from the constant noise and stress. Reason 6. Orders to attack impossible positions. Sacrificial lambs. Generals would order attacks on positions that were obviously impossible to take. The generals were far from the trenches, didn't see the conditions, didn't understand the difficulties. They would look at maps, would see what they thought was an advantage, would order an attack. Soldiers would go over the top, would be slaughtered, would accomplish nothing, and the general would order another attack, and another. The generals seemed content to sacrifice thousands of soldiers for tiny gains in terrain. In some cases, armies would gain a few hundred meters of trench, losing thousands of soldiers. Then, days later, would lose that terrain back. The military leadership seemed willing to sacrifice unlimited soldiers to grind down the enemy. Reason 5. Shell shock and psychological breakdown, the mind giving up. Many soldiers developed what was called shell shock. They couldn't function, couldn't sleep, couldn't stop trembling, but military leadership didn't recognize shell shock as a real condition. Soldiers with shell shock were accused of being cowards, were executed for desertion. A soldier who had been traumatized by months in the trenches would desert, would try to escape, would fail, would be court-martialed, would be executed by firing squad, in front of his comrades, as a lesson to others. This added to the horror of the trenches. Not only could you die from enemy action, you could be executed by your own army for being too traumatized to function. Reason 4. Trench raids, sudden death in the night. At night, soldiers would conduct raids on enemy trenches. The goal was to gather intelligence, to demoralize the enemy, to kill enemy soldiers. Soldiers would climb out of the trenches in darkness, would sneak across no man's land, would attack enemy positions with grenades and bayonets. The fighting would be hand-to-hand, personal, brutal. Soldiers would see the face of the man they were killing. The raids were dangerous. Many soldiers were killed or captured, but they continued, night after night, raid after raid. Reason 3. Living conditions, mud, cold, and darkness. The trenches were filled with mud, sometimes waist-deep. Soldiers would stand in mud for hours, for days, for weeks. The mud was cold, wet. The soldiers would develop trench foot, would develop hypothermia. In winter, soldiers would freeze, would develop frostbite. In summer, the trenches would stink. Disease would spread. The trenches had almost no light. The soldiers lived in near darkness. The darkness was oppressive. The mud was oppressive. The conditions were designed to break a person. Reason 2. The numbers. Millions died for nothing. World War I killed more people than any previous war. Approximately 20 million soldiers died. Approximately 21 million more were wounded. In total, about 40 million casualties. In a war that lasted only 4 years. The Battle of the Somme, 1 million casualties in 4 months. To advance a few kilometers. The Battle of Verdun, 700,000 casualties. To advance a few kilometers. The numbers were staggering. The scale of death was unprecedented, and it was concentrated in the trenches. Millions of soldiers died in the trenches. Millions more were wounded, scarred, traumatized. Reason 1. The futility. All this death for nothing. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of trench warfare was its futility. Soldiers died by the millions, yet nothing was accomplished. 4 years of slaughter, 4 years of death, 4 years of suffering, and at the end, the battle lines were barely different from where they started. Soldiers would attack a position, would lose thousands, would capture the position. Then the enemy would counterattack, would retake the position, would lose thousands. The same ground would be fought over again and again. Each time thousands would die. Generals seemed content to sacrifice soldiers indefinitely, seemed to believe that attrition would eventually break the enemy. The enemy never broke. Soldiers just kept dying. A soldier in the trenches wasn't fighting for a noble cause, wasn't fighting to achieve something, was fighting in a war that seemed to have no purpose, no strategy, no end. A soldier in the trenches was simply waiting to die.